My amendment will eliminate $535 million in new funding for ICE officers and provide $30 million to the DHS Office of the Inspector General and $10 million to the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. Simply put, my amendment makes it clear that we must increase oversight and accountability over the Department of Homeland Security. Reports of unlawful turnbacks of asylum seekers have only increased. The May 2017 Human Rights First report, Crossing the Line, flagged 125 incidents where asylum seekers were denied full access to the U.S. And just last month, the American Immigration Council and others filed a class action lawsuit challenging CBP's continued practice of turning back asylum seekers requesting protection at ports of entry. The Trump administration's anti-immigrant rhetoric and policy appear to have emboldened this CBP practice. CBP personnel also reportedly stated, and this is a quote, "Donald Trump just signed new laws saying there is no asylum for anyone," end quote. We've also heard reports of CBP turning away asylum seekers through threats, coercion, and intimidation. CBP reportedly threatened to take away asylum seekers' children unless they left the port of entry and let loose dogs unless the asylum seekers exited the port of entry. We've also heard CBP turning away asylum seekers through verbal and physical abuse. CBP reportedly threw an asylum seeker's 6-year-old daughter to the ground and knocked a transgender asylum seeker to the floor, and then stepped on her neck. These are not only unconscionable, Mr. Chairman, they may violate U.S. and international law, both the Immigration and Naturalization Act, which guarantees the right of an individual present within the United States or arriving at a U.S. port of entry to apply for asylum, and also they may violate the principle of non-refoulement articulated in the 1951 Refugee Convention and enshrined in U.S. law in the 1967 Protocol relating to the status of refugees. This prohibits the return of asylum seekers to a country where their lives or freedom would be threatened on account of protected grounds. Mr. Chairman, I now yield 1 minute to the ranking member of the Homeland Security Appropriations Subcommittee, Ms. Roybal-Allard.
The gentlelady yields.
Okay, I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I want to express my strong support for the gentlewoman's amendment. As I said during general debate, the increases in the bill for ICE's enforcement, detention, and removal operations are excessive. They support an overly aggressive immigration enforcement approach that is tearing apart families and communities, and that is unnecessary for national security or public safety. The cut to ICE operations and support by this amendment would leave sufficient funding for ICE to carry out its responsibilities humanely and fairly. And the increases the amendment proposes for the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties and the Office of the Inspector General are clearly needed to ensure appropriate oversight of the Department's activities. I urge my colleagues to support the Jayapal amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady reserves. Purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
The proposal to cut ICE funding for enforcement of immigration laws and removal of those here illegally will endanger the safety of the American people and convey to bad actors that the rule of law no longer exists in the United States, leading to increased border crossings and even more illegal aliens in the United States. Cutting funding for beds will lead to the release of criminal and other removable aliens into the communities across the country and weaken the United States border security. I ask you to join me in opposing this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just remind my colleagues again that ICE has plenty of money to carry out their activities. What we're asking for through this amendment is to have some oversight and accountability to make sure that we are seeing the kind of abuse and turnbacks that we've been seeing. Let me just remind my colleagues of the grave and critical need on one level to address sexual assault and abuse in detention. Between May 2014 and July 2016, the Office of the Inspector General received at minimum 1,016 reports of sexual abuse in detention. In other words, they received more than one complaint of sexual abuse each day over the course of 26 months. And according to Civic, a detention watchdog, only 2.4% of those complaints were investigated. So I could go on, Mr. Chairman, but I think that what this amendment is trying to say is we desperately need to ensure that we use the funds that we are appropriating here, the funds that we are taking away, in order to make sure that we have accountability for the Department of Department of Homeland Security, and to make sure, for example, that when we have Prison Rape Elimination Act regulations to prevent sexual assault in immigration detention, that we have adequate funding to the Department of Homeland Security's Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Department so that they can carry out the audits to ensure that immigration detention facilities are in compliance with those regulations. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that my colleagues will accept that we still are going to have plenty of money for ICE to do its job, but we want to make sure we have accountability. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I yield back. I'm still in opposition to this amendment.
The
I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Washington. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States already operates the largest immigration detention system in the world at a cost of $2 billion annually. In fiscal year 2017, ICE had capacity to detain an unprecedented 39,324 men, women, and children. Although a large amount of funds are dedicated to detain these people, the system is plagued with inhumane conditions and inadequate oversight. Mr. Chairman, my amendment imposes a moratorium on the construction and expansion of immigration detention facilities. This year, we are seeing the highest number of deaths in ICE custody since 2011. Private, for-profit detention facilities in particular have not abided by basic standards necessary to protect civil and constitutional rights. And all of this is occurring at the same time that the administration is increasing enforcement, including expedited removals with inadequate due process, elimination of the long-standing division between local police and federal immigration enforcement, and this is all tearing families apart. The overreach of these detention facilities, combined with an overreach on enforcement in general, instead of focusing on more practical, humane, and frankly economically viable options of alternatives to detention. These are issues that Congress must address. We should not be funding these dangerous overreaches by expanding immigration detention with no accountability. This amendment ensures that we focus on fixing this broken system as opposed to funding increased detention expansion. And this is deadly. It's a deadly powder keg. And I don't use the term deadly lightly. I'd like to take a moment to talk about Jacinta Morales, a woman from Oregon detained at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington. Jacinta found out she was pregnant while she was in detention. She said, "I was thrilled to be pregnant and thrilled at the prospect of being a mother again." When she found out that she would be deported, torn from her 11-year-old U.S. citizen son, as well as her longtime partner, Jacinta was devastated. She experienced pain and nausea, and not long after, she woke up bleeding. After an hour, where she waited another hour. One of the people who was seen before her had a toothache. When the doctor finally saw her, they requested an ambulance to take her to the hospital. But the ambulance didn't come for a long time, and so they took her in the back of a patrol car where she was forced to sit up, making the bleeding worse. When Jacinta finally arrived at the hospital, she learned she had a miscarriage. Jacinta is one of 292 pregnant women ICE detained between January and April of 2017 alone, and part of the 60% of detained women. Formerly detained women and their attorneys and advocates have reported that pregnant women only receive the bare minimum of services and accommodations and are routinely denied extra blankets, additional food, and adequate prenatal care. When pregnant women are referred to outside obstetricians, ICE policy does not prohibit the shackling of pregnant women during transport. Moreover, the stress of detention and fear of miscarriage may lead detained women to abandon their asylum claims. One of these women, I'm going to call her Anna, accepted deportation back into the hands of her abuser because she was so afraid that being detained would harm her unborn child. ICE's own detention standards and directive on the detention of pregnant women acknowledges the complexity and risks of detaining pregnant women, but implementation and oversight are not enough to protect these women. It is irresponsible to expand detention while the agency struggles to conduct even basic oversight and hold facilities accountable for inhumane conditions. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose the gentleman from Texas rise?
I rise in opposition. I rise in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And it seems the minority has a very good tag team match going here. Previous amendment would eliminate, if it passes, all of the privately owned facilities, leaving us with, by the gentle lady's own statement, 3,500 beds for detainees, whereas our total population today ranges from 35,000 to 40,000 people that are detained, which means all those people would have to be released or placed in some kind of alternative, of which the no-show from that alternative is horrendous. This kind of restriction makes no sense, even though there's nobody planning to build ICE facilities right now. To restrict the government from a possible need, should that need arise. And I remind you that in 2014, in the month of August, 78,000 children came across the border, and an equal number or more of child with parent came across the border in Laredo, the Laredo sector alone. So we have real needs that need to be met, and quite honestly, this amendment ties the hands and everybody gets turned loose. I very much oppose this amendment. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have left?
45 seconds.
Mr. Chairman, I will just say that we currently have almost 40,000 people in detention. We're not proposing eliminating all detention centers. We're saying we're putting a moratorium on expansion of detention centers. Those people would still be able to stay there. We could detain up to that many people. I don't think that's the right policy for the United States of America, but I'm not saying that we're going to eliminate all of that detention space. What I'm is that we need accountability around the detention system. And as long as we don't have that accountability, and we have pregnant women who are losing children in the ICE detention facilities, I believe that we should ensure that we have accountability. And, you know, I'll tell you that we are continuing to detain and not hold these detention centers accountable for any of the things that happen within the detention centers. So again, I hope that my colleagues will support this amendment and allow us to bring some accountability back to our detention system. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman is recognized.
Yield back.
Yields back. The question is on amendment offered by the gentlelady from Washington. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The opinion chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.